So welcome everyone. I'm very happy to receive you all on Zoom tonight, depending. To tonight's conversation with Gabriela Jauregui in the framework of Cinthia Marcelles' survey exhibition, Disobedient Tools, at the Museum Martha Herford in Herford, which will be on 2 more weeks until the end of May, until the 29th of May. My name is Roberta Goetz. I'm working as a curator here at the Martha Herford, and I work together with Cinthia to develop her show here for the museum. As you all might know, we borrowed the exhibition title from an essay that was written by Gabriela Jauregui in 2018, and which speaks of a concern that is also really important of Cinthia's practice since the late 90s. The question is how to disorganize hierarchies in society, and or hierarchies that are based on normatively defined patriarchal values and notions of identity. Furthermore, the motive of the tool is in Cinthia's work, literally, but also figuratively, very present. And in the sense of that she often defunctionalizes or refunctionalizes objects and materials to defy fixed meaning. And in some works, such as Family and Disorder, actual tools, or what we describe as such, are not allowed as building instruments. So other things have to be repurposed, like bricks. Or in other works, like for example, like entre para perante, in between two towards, where she wraps found tools in shoelaces and thus defunctionalizes them and questions their object status. So we invited Gabriela to talk about her essay, from which we borrowed the title, and to hear about her central ideas and the context it was written in. I think that's very important, and it's important that we hear it directly from her. Gabriela Jauregui is born in Mexico, where she still lives and works, amongst other places, such as recently Napoli for residency as a writer, translator, and editor. And I would also want to add activist, although I know that Gabriela doesn't like to call herself an activist. Perhaps we can talk about that later. Her latest novel, Feral, was published last winter in Mexico and in Spain at the publishing house Sexto Piso. Currently, she's working on the English translation of her Anthologie Tsunami, which will be published in the United States, or in the English-speaking press, Feminist Press, it's called Feminist Press, in 2024, which the publication, which now I try to show it again, but it doesn't disappear. The publication originally was published in 2018 with Sexto Piso, and the essay Disobedient Tools is also part of this publication. It was celebrated as a really significant contribution to decolonial and feminist thought and practice, along with its follow-up volume, Tsunami 2, that was published in 2020. She is further author of Many Fiestas from 2017, Leash Seeks Lost Bitch from 2016, and Controlled Decay from 2008, as well as the author of the short story collection La Memoria de las Cosas, published with Sexto Piso in 2015. Her creative and critical writing have been published in anthologies, journals, magazines, internationally, and she teaches in the English department at the UNAM, at the College for Modern Literature at the UNAM in Mexico City. And I would also like to add that I think her practice goes way further than just collecting texts by authors and publishing books. I would describe it as a kind of a more holistic approach, I would say, because it's more about making a platform for diverse voices, for a great variety of voices, and giving voice also to people that perhaps normally would not be heard. And for most people who identify, you work mostly with people that identify with women or non-binary, and and I think this platform can be a book, can be a reading, can be very different ways of of support and giving visibility and being heard to people, which is, I think, very, very important, and which is also not always public. So thank you very, very much, Gabriela Jauregui, for being with us today and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that generous introduction. Go ahead.
Just organizational question or comment. We are happy to receive all questions and comments. Please add them in the Q&A function, or kind of like in the section, and we will come to that in the end of our conversation. So I would like to start, Gabriela, with asking you, perhaps you could explain us kind of like what is the context, what was and is still the context of your essay, Disobedient Tools, within this book, and like, because it's an anthology with, I have not counted them, but like 10 other texts, essays by different people. Perhaps you could tell us about that first.
Sure. But first of all, yeah, thank you again for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I'm really honored and happy that my text, was that you thought of putting my text together with Cinthia's work, because it's really very, very important and beautiful work. So I was very inspired and thankful. And also thank you to the Martha Herford Museum for having us tonight and hosting this talk. Well, so the context was, and sadly still is, that of extreme gender-based violence in Mexico. So as some of you may know, in Mexico currently, every day, 10 women and girls are killed. And so they're victims of femicide. And it's almost, I would say, almost sort of institutional violence, not just, out there on the street or in an apartment where your partner is murdering you. It's something that has to do with the entire sort of state apparatus. So it seems very, very, very disheartening, as you can imagine. Also, creates great anger and resistance, and happily also organization. And women have been coming together to sort of go on the streets. Also people who work with institutions and the government, to talk to the government, to try to, establish laws and systems to counter all of this. But it still happens. So clearly it's, something that goes deeper than something that has to do with the state, but it's happening at every level. So when I decided I wanted to make this book, the Tsunami book, I was trying to think of a way to articulate what was going on in the streets with, grassroots level collectives, women, going out, marching, etc. And what was going on in academia with wonderful thinkers and writers, professors who are coming up with, fabulous, very important, relevant concepts, but sometimes in languages that people on the street don't necessarily understand, but that they're living that concept in their skin, in their bodies, in practice, right? So I felt that at that point in 2018, a lot of those sort of bridging conversations were taking place on social media, right? So on Twitter and Facebook, etc., Instagram, and so on. But that often they would get sort of either, passed over with a, little smiling cat meme, and then like an ad, and then, some horrifying news about a flood somewhere, and then, et cetera, et cetera. This is the way social media operates. And so there wouldn't be time to really continue that conversation before it got superseded in the sort of feed or whatever. At the same time, I was also very concerned about the amount of violent responses if a woman sort of spoke out on social media about gender violence or about whatever, you know, violence in the workplace, whatever, there would invariably be some person replying something horrifying, like, oh, shut up, I won't even use the words, horrifying words, and then, I will rape you, you will get murdered, whatever, just like insane violence, which we all know happens on social media quite quickly. So I really thought, okay, we need a space where we can actually develop these thoughts in a non-academic setting, beyond the streets and its immediacy, but without the violent, vitriol and speed of social media, where we would have time to sort of sit and think together. So that's when I thought, okay, let's make this book. And one of the sort of big lessons, this book was a huge lesson for me in politics and everything, was okay, I thought, oh, so we're all fighting against, we're all fighting the good fight. We're all fighting against patriarchy and, state violence, everything I just said. We're all like on the same boat. We all agree. And then we're probably all coming at this from a feminist point of view, for instance. And so that was my first, like, lesson, was like, well, no, that could be even considered, and now it's much more talked about, but at that point, nobody was talking about how that's also a colonial point of view. Of course, feminism has its roots in the Western tradition, in the 18th century in France, Olympe de Gouges, and so on and so forth. But anti-patriarchal, sort of rebellious thought and practice obviously precedes that ever since the colonies started. And there's always been women who have been pushing back or organizing and thinking about the world in other ways. They were just not called feminists, right? So, one of the authors was a fantastic thinker, probably, I think, one of the most relevant thinkers in Mexico, Yasna Yelena Aguilar Gil. She is an Ayuk indigenous woman and a linguist. Her text was basically, a lesson in rethinking that. And that also, made me question, like, oh, do we all have to sort of rally around this word feminist to actually fight the good fight? And I was like, oh, no, actually, no. And actually, that might be part of the problem, is to want to perhaps totalize and encompass everything. Like, oh, we're all the same. We're all thinking the same way. We're all going to, and one of the things that, of course, indigenous struggles in Mexico teach us is that, as the Zapatistas would say, we want a world where there are many worlds, not just one vision, one way of doing things. And of course, everyone knows the danger of the single story, right? The danger of a single thought. It turns into totalitarianism. So that's also sort of politically one of the roots of this book, was like, oh, okay, so let's think about this from as many plural, diverging and converging points of view as possible. And I think that perhaps that's why, as you said, the book was very, important and successful when it came out. It was quite surprising, and it was really beautiful to see, the book presentations with so many very young women with the book, buying the book, having a conversation about this. That was obviously beyond my, my dreams and intentions. But I think it was because really there was much need, like an urgent need, to have that space, to create that space and those conversations. So, and from that sort of diverse, plural, there are also in this book, so not only people who are racialized or women who are racialized, but also women. The oldest author is now 94 years old, Margot Glantz. And so she's basically, if we go by the feminist waves, she's basically a part of all the waves. Because when she was young, there was still she didn't have a right to vote. So she's still part of like the first wave of feminism and the second, and so she's like a witness to all of that. And then the youngest author at the time of publication was 18 years old. So we had a span of different points of view, because age obviously matters, and influences what we're worried about, how we're thinking about the problems, and so on. And people from all over the country.
And different education
So
context as well. I think that's
totally
also very important.
Yeah. So women from, rural communities, women from the city, women from small towns, where, for example, the war on drugs has absolutely devastated their cities or little small villages.
Mm-hmm.
So women who have very diverse life experiences and they're not all of them are not writers, but one thing that was very important to me, and now we're going to get into the tools, was that all of the women who are part of these collections use language as a tool, as a way of accessing thought and hopefully transforming our reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the way we perceive our reality, which
Mm-hmm.
in turn then maybe is a small a small step towards changing that reality.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, some of them are linguists, some of them are journalists, some of them are talking about being moms, other ones are talking about femicide, gender violence. Some of them are, very female presenting in the way their bodies look and are in the world. Others are, more masculine. Their sexual preferences are very different. Their gender orientation is also on a spectrum, let's say. So there was a very big sort of diversity in both of these volumes. And I think that's been also one of one of the reasons people connected, because it wasn't, like a bourgeois woman from Mexico City telling people like, oh, this is what being a woman is about, or this is our struggle. It was women who have very different points of view, very different struggles, and concerns that are very, very diverse. And so, yeah, it helped to build a sort of conversation, and also to feel like even within those differences, we were all sort of walking together somehow. So there were points in the book. This is also the kinds of surprises and gifts that come with building something like this. There's a lot of pain in there, a lot of violence, but also the end feeling of them is one of like a big hug, or being like, arm in arm with friends or sisters, which was, quite surprising. It was not necessarily what I had expected. And funnily enough, that's sort of what I was invoking in my text, this idea of a community, of collaboration. And of course, I was writing it at the same time as everyone else was writing their text when I invited them. So it wasn't like I wrote it after I knew what was going on. It was, it was almost like an invocation of sorts into this idea of collective, the power and the beauty and the complexity of collective action.
And I was wondering, like, while I was reading just now, like you sent me like the still in process English translation of it. I mean, I knew it until today only in Spanish, and now, like, as I also said, that you're going to translate the book and it's going to be published in the United States or in England? United States, no?
In the US.
Next year. I was wondering, like, how much, I mean, it happens, I mean, 2018 until now, so much happened. And how is it for you to kind of like, did you change? Are you are you editing the text in a little, like in a way that kind of like adding comments or kind of like footnotes, just because of this kind of jump of time and also context? I mean, it's different if like the audience who reads it comes from like a Mexican or Latin American context. It's so different than like from the US. So I was wondering, like, how do you treat, of like, how is your understanding of the process of translating it, like in time and like readership, like readers?
Yeah, it's a complicated and delicate sort of balance that we're trying to navigate. So on the one hand, what we decided with I have now a co-editor and co-translator for this. Her name's Heather Cleary. She's a wonderful, wonderful translator from the US. And we decided the process of the translation should be, similar to the process of the book itself. So we gathered a diverse group of translators who translate from Spanish into English. And so we're all going to have this sort of collective workshopping of the translations. So that'll be a really beautiful, fun process, because otherwise, you're just like translating in front of your screen.
Yeah.
But it's always, obviously, as almost everything, many people thinking together ends in a better result than just one person, doing something by herself. So that's one of the things that we decided. We also, for instance, in my text, there were a couple of footnotes that I wanted to add because, it's been quite a few years now. And as for context, we will write an introduction that sort of speaks about all these things we've been talking about here, and that will frame the work, and in its context, and then sort of speak of why it's relevant outside of Mexico also. And it'll include a selection of texts from both tsunamis, from 1 and 2. So it'll be nice. It'll be like 2018, 2020. And now this year, a third volume is coming out.
But in Spanish first only.
In Spanish first, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing. Yeah, I'm very happy that this is going to be translated to and published in English, because I think it's such a, for me, it was really an important book. It really kind of shaped my thinking, and it until now also, starting working with Cinthia, it was very kind of stuck to me, and I kind of I talked with her about it, and then she actually suggested to use that we could ask you if we could borrow your title as her title for the show. So perhaps we can now jump into the text. I think it's as I said before, I talked about the motive of tools figuratively and literally in Cinthia's work. So I was wondering if you could tell all of us, because no one, apart from me, or I don't know, we don't know who read the Spanish version, but the people who couldn't have access because of language don't know your text. So I think it would be amazing if you could share with us kind of what are your tools? What are your disobedient tools? What is it kind of figuratively and literally perhaps also referring to?
Yeah, so first, I wanted to go back to Cynthia's work and really keep that image in mind of these tools that she's wrapped, and how that transforms them. It at the same time as it makes them useless, it also transforms them into something else and gives them another sort of power or potential, right? So there's the idea of potential there that that is something that I think is very much a part of this idea of disobedient tools, the potential of something transforming, right? And to me, of course, the ground tool, as I mentioned before, is language. Language is, my point zero. And of course, it's a very complex tool. It is in some ways a tool, or has been a tool of control, of colonialism, of erasure, etc. But it can also be a tool of retelling, transforming, liberating, etc. Right? So it's a double-edged sword, as they say in English. So that's where I wanted to start. And that's where the whole essay starts. And I borrow this question from Ursula K. Le Guin, where she asks, when we close our eyes and we think of women writing, what do we think of? Right? And so I was thinking, okay, so we don't necessarily, what does it mean? It also sort of revisits, the idea of a room of one's own. It revisits a bunch of things, of course, Hélène Cixous and Simone de Beauvoir, all of these important thinkers and writers. What does it mean, and how do we imagine, and how can this connect with other women, right? Not just academics and writers and so on. So I was thinking, I immediately thought of the kitchen table. That's where I do a lot of my writing, and then I just have to push all of the, breakfast stuff or the lunch things and then put it back together. And actually in the second tsunami, there's a text by Dalia de la Cerda, wonderful philosopher and activist, who's like, I write on the toilet. She works at a street market, so she writes while she's like selling stuff on the street market and so on. So that idea of writing, connecting to all kinds of women in all kinds of situations was sort of the first little seed for that. But then I was trying to imagine tools within our sort of late capitalist system that are sort of subverting or, opening small cracks in that system for other things to flourish, right? And I give examples that are still totally relevant and still completely inspiring to me, like the Women in Latino Health Access, which is a organization in Southern California where I lived for a long time, that helps migrant communities, undocumented migrant communities also, of course, specifically, to access health, right? Health centers, etc. And as we know, diabetes and things like this are very huge disease in migrant communities, and people who are undocumented often are too afraid to go and try to get help, right? So one of the things they do, for instance, to get women's groups happening is they would go and sort of hang out at the line for tortilla. So if we were, in Europe, maybe it would be the line outside the bakery when, bread is coming out very early in the morning, but here it's for the tortillas, right? And get into like very casual conversation and then say, oh, we're getting together and we're going to have a knitting circle or whatever, something like this sort of stitching gathering or whatever. Because of course, if you come up to someone and you say, oh, we're going to have a talk about gender violence and, domestic violence. Do you want to come? Obviously, this is very alienating. You're like, no, I don't. Or if you give someone a card and, your husband is beating on you and finds a little card that says, domestic violence help or whatever, it's going to get worse, right? So these are other ways. These are ways to subvert. These are small, disobedient tools. So people come and they're like, okay, we're going to have a knitting circle. And then suddenly someone starts talking about, oh, this is what happened to me the other day. And suddenly you're having a gender violence talk and prevention group or whatever, or health group, without it seeming like that's what you had, right? One of the footnotes I would love to add was this group also in the United States of basically moms, when, as you know, they started putting children in sort of detention centers, is a polite way of calling these sort of camps, imprisonment camps, where the children were in cages, and these horrifying images that I think went around the world. And some mothers, these children in some cases had to be held there until they were able to send them, or a family member could come and collect them, right? So they would stay there for a long time because in many situations, these family members have no money and they live on the other side of a very, very large country. So some mothers were like, this is horrifying. Let's organize. These aren't activists. These aren't academics. These aren't people, policymakers. No, they're just like a mom who was horrified about this story and was like, I'm going to make a little ride chat on WhatsApp. And so this, again, WhatsApp, a tool by a company that is like completely complicit in late capitalism and its disasters, right? But it's being used in subversive ways, right? So these women are organizing on WhatsApp and they're like, okay, I'm going to drive this kid from New Mexico to the border with Texas. And then you, Anna, are like, okay, I'm in Texas, so I'm going to pick this kid up and take them to the border with, you know, the next state, and then someone there, another mom on WhatsApp will pick up this child, and that way the child ends up with their family member and has been, you know, sort of taken care of by a group of moms who got together on WhatsApp on a chat. So those are the moments where I think that these tools, like the ones in Cinthia's piece, can be wrapped in something else to do something completely different that is actually directly in opposition to the way they have been built and thought of, right? So we're not innocent, of course, in saying, oh, these are, you know, like the internet is fabulous. We know how dangerous, we know every single thing that happens there. However, there are moments where these sort of oppressive tools, including language, can be hacked and cracked slightly ever so open to create change and difference and beauty and transformation, right? So I think that's really.
Yeah. Can I add something? I think it's kind of like also important to kind of add what you also say in the kind of like, I think it's quite in the end that you also talk about, like, not only that those spaces, those hacked spaces give kind of like the people who like contribute, like who see it as a way to open themselves, but it's like the most kind of like a very important part is the listening, that they have someone to listen, or that people are listening to that person. There is like a very, very strong political kind of like subversive also moment of being listened. Someone listens to you, but because only through that something else can happen.
Absolutely. And the act of listening is a radically political one, right? Because it also implies vulnerability. It implies letting the other in. It implies it implies where there was just one, suddenly there's two or more, right? So it's like, it implies immediately a community. So interesting things that start to happen in these tiny little spaces of disobedience, right? So that's why that's the title for it. But also it was about looking at tiny little things that seem unimportant, that are like micro political actions, and how those little micro political actions as a little archipelago actually then start to create like a larger change, right? I think that really, if you know, we haven't all collapsed, it's because of these tiny little things that happen every day, and that subvert and disobey, you know, this idea of radical individualism, of survival of the fittest, and everything else that sort of capitalism teaches us. And it's also the opening of these spaces that, you know, Anna Tsing calls peri-capitalist spaces. So it's very hard to imagine places where capitalism doesn't exist, but there are many spaces and places, including lots of indigenous communities in Mexico, that live in this like periphery of that system, so that they can teach us how to sort of, you know, ways out, little cracks and little like points of view. So anyway, that was the whole sort of concept behind the text. And I definitely wanted it to be a text that left us with some hope, as opposed to, you know, since I knew that some of the other texts would be dealing with intense like violence and you know, I wanted us to also think, okay, this is also possible. There are other things that can also happen without, you know, minimizing at all this tragedy and pain and anger, but also saying, oh yes, but this is also possible.
I think for me, it was also like, I mean, the spaces that you talked about, this might be like the tupper party or the WhatsApp group or whatever. for me, it was also kind of like what I was interested in is also like how those spaces, I would think, like carry kind of like a heterotopic quality, because they're like within society, but the rules, the kind of the system, like is not the same. The condition within that is not the same. And also, I think it was very powerful how you write about, like, especially if we talk about WhatsApp or I don't know, Facebook Messenger or different kinds of like ways of communicating with each other, kind of chat groups online where people participate without image, without name. They can choose their identity. They kind of choose avatars, and they choose their identity. So like I think that you also talk about like in the real world, so to say, like every one of us is always kind of judged upon, like, I don't know, body size, body shape, like like skin colors, etc. Like so many kind of like categories that are kind of like from the outside and kind of interpreted from the outside and kind of projected on you. And but within the digital or kind of like virtual context, you can, no one sees you, so you can choose your um identity, and so also like choose the way you relate to one another, and choose also like language. That's, for me, that was also the disobedience. So kind of like disobedient in the sense of like inventing a new language, because it doesn't have a reference yet. So like you even choose the referent, you build the referent and choose the language to refer to that referent.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, now it all has a, you know, a darker, there's like the B side to all of this, especially because in 2018, AI, artificial intelligence, was really not, you know, it was barely slow. It really seemed like something like, oh my God, yes, whatever. But now suddenly in the past, you know, even 6 months, things have exploded into, you know, insanely interesting, but also complex and perhaps, you know, problematic uses of AI. And so, you know, now speaking of, yeah, avatars and a conversation online almost sounds a little naive because, of course, now we can even have a chat with a bot that will tell you, you know, if you go on Chat GPT and you're like, oh, what should I do to, you know, feel better about this? And then the robot will be like, oh, yeah, blah, 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 you know? So it seems a little like, oh, yeah, okay, well, that was 2018. But still, even then, there were already, again, two ways of using it. Of course, anonymity, anything that has anonymity can entail two things, right? You can use it for super hardcore right-wing horrible things, or you can use it to organize in all these other ways. Of course, anonymous is called anonymous for a reason, right? Um, and so putting that aside for a minute, it's a very complex and long conversation, but putting it aside for a minute and only looking at the potential, the subversive potential of the use of language in those spaces. That's those moments of utopia, or heterotopia is a better, I like that you use that concept, because they're not quite entirely utopian spaces, but really, yeah, like heterotopic spaces where we can start to put like rehearse other ways. It's not that like it's now happening and we've now transformed everything, but they are small rehearsals that are like chipping away at hegemony, right? And at hegemonic language, at so on and so forth. I mean, also since 2018, there have been several things that have happened, for instance, in Mexico, including the passing of certain trans identity laws, the more widespread use of gender inclusive language, and at the same time, of course, hardcore resistance
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, lashing back from the right wing, you know, politicians and so on. But those small things were rehearsed in spaces like these, where people were like, okay, what about using in Spanish, for instance, there was the use, first of all, of the arroba, the at sign to include like O and A for masculine and feminine. Then there was the use of the X. Then there was the use of the E. These are things that, of course, are not happening in academia. They're happening in these kinds of forums, spaces, conversations, social media, on the street, etc. And then sort of start to filter up and down and all around, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those those are the moments where, you know, again, putting aside all the big picture complexity of the internet
Mm-hmm.
with all its dark sides and, you know, etc. For a minute, we can also think of how it is used to hack hegemony
Mm-hmm.
in so many tiny ways,
Mm-hmm.
or to connect people. I have to say, lots of the Tsunami authors are women I didn't know in person necessarily, but women I was reading on Twitter, etc., and who were like very vocal about things that I was like, oh, this is really smart. What she's saying is wonderful and
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. And I would write them like, hi, who, you know, because they don't live in Mexico City. We're not from the same generation. We don't come from the same social, you know, milieu. So then we would just connect over. So yeah, I know a lot of horrible things happen there, but also beautiful things can happen there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, including what you're saying, this idea of someone's listening.
Mm-hmm.
Someone is
Mm-hmm.
listening to all that crazy amount of information, for better or worse. And in this case, that was also for better, because that's how a bunch of us got to meet each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up turning out that a lot of them knew each other from activists organizing online and then taking it to the streets. And some of them only knew each other online and finally met in person in like book presentations for Tsunami, things like that. So, you know, yes,
Yeah.
avatars and online forums and chats, double-edged swords for sure.
Yeah, I think it's like, for me, it was like, I also like the way I read your book and kind of like your observation also is like that that it's might be those spaces, but in general we need kind of spaces that somehow with their conditions somehow like anticipate like a system that we aspire for, kind of like as we said before, for example, like that you're not identified as woman or man or whatever, that it's like that this doesn't matter, that there is no reason why you even need to be identified as like from the outside. And I think that's kind of like this, like what I found kind of like very, or I find like very like interesting and strong and like inspirational, that this kind of like this place that we can create somehow, this little space where conditions kind of like are as we wish them to be, and in this space we can test out also new like language, new words, also like as you described, like with the like how to kind of adapt or kind of like yeah, change language like that it's gender inclusive. And I mean that's also like a big debate obviously in Germany, like really big debate around it. But I think it's like, and in that sense I think it's interesting that we're kind of used, or like like perhaps I talk about myself, I was always used to think of language as a kind of created by this, like is kind of like created by the system we live in. But I never thought about kind of like that we could also switch it around. So like why could the way we speak, the way the words or the expressions we use, not also like long term, obviously not like that, but like long term change the system, or kind of the circumstances, the way we relate to one another. I think that's kind of like what this way of thinking was very exciting for me. It was very like strong and inspirational. And I think that's very strong in your book, or like in that text also particular.
Yeah, and I'm so so happy and glad to hear that. But yes, I agree. I mean, language, as we know, even though certain people want to sort of only keep it one way, language is both descriptive and prescriptive. Like that's how it works. It's, you know, describing the world we live in, but it's also creating, you know, in doing so, it's also creating it. And it is shaped back. Language is shaped back by the world that is being created and then helps the world emerge. No, worlds that we're creating emerge. So it's like, so it works both ways. And so we can't, you know, that's also, I guess, why it's such a curious and powerful tool at the end of the day, because it can, it cuts both ways, right? So it builds, it shapes, it makes, it also reflects, it also opens possibilities and potentials. And so yeah, that's why I think, I mean, I guess that's why I love doing what I do and working with that material and those tools. And again, it once and again, I think I always think of this example in Africa. It's again a hetero topic, with Fela Kuti, the musician, who was also a politician and activist in Nigeria, and who was trying to sort of think about this idea of a global English. So of course, English was the language of the colonists and was a language that had, you know, come to take over or destroy certain languages, local languages, but it also, in doing so, became one language that unified a bunch of people that before maybe were speaking, you know, Guyu over here and Igbo over there, and were not communicating. And suddenly they had English, and then they could communicate and organize to subvert colonial order, right? So this is another one of those examples of, okay, so this is what happens with language. And this is, again, in a way, what happens in digital space. So it can be used to control, surveil, etc. But sometimes, in certain ways, it can be hacked and subverted for freedom and potential.
But if I understand you correctly, also in your text, like you quite in the end, you talk about like you say, like that those, perhaps you can talk about that too afterwards, like the detour, how do you say, like in English, the détournement, like the detoured like language or words, like they are just in between, so like a temporary status. So I was wondering, like what, like how do you imagine, or like how, or can you make an example perhaps, like what the final, or like the step after the temporary step would be?
I mean, I feel like we are in a almost semi-permanent place of permanent steps. I think that it's very hard to think, at least now, or at least for me, to imagine this final step or this final sort of horizon that we've reached it. I guess, you know, that would be like, oh, okay, freedom, equality, well-being for everyone. But in the meantime, that horizon is always sort of, as we are walking towards it, it is also sort of walking a little bit away from us. So I like to, I even changed now when I give like workshops and things like this, I don't even call them herramientas, which is tools. I now call them herramientas, you know, for the time, mientras, like for the time being, because they're something that we can sort of take for now, for this situation, and use, and then maybe the same tools or the same, yeah, I mean, thinking again about what's happening with AI, maybe the tools that were relevant in 2018 are not so relevant in 2023, but they were back then. We've used them, a little crack was made, and now we are thinking of other things, right? So I don't know. It's hard to tell. For me, like to say, okay, this is the final objective. I'm not sure. I mean, other than what I just said, of course, you know, where we're all like in a state of well-being and fairness and justice and happiness and liberty for all. Sure. But in the meantime, we have all these little steps.
Yeah. I think also like that's like what I also thought about, like in my essay, where I obviously like also referenced, like, or kind of like started with the reference to your text, that I kind of like end thinking about, like, perhaps that's also like kind of this kind of like this never, like, it can never finish, never conclude. That's the like the good, like that's kind of like something that always brings us to continue fighting. But that's also like what I thought about, like talking about, for example, like a democratic system, a democratic, like whatever we like, if we talk about Germany or whatever like country, is like is it really democratic? Like, does everyone have the same saying? It's not. So it's kind of like, I think perhaps, but that's kind of like, that's a hetero topic, or kind of like the productive quality also of it, that we call it, we, like, as I said before, it's kind of like we think about a system we want to live in, and we try to call it as the system we live in, but they were not yet. But it's kind of like, so we constantly have to fight for what it actually, what we want it to be, what we want the conditions to be in.
Yeah, and then at the same time as we're saying this, what comes to mind is, you know, in a place like Mexico, there are, however, very concrete things that need to happen. Like, like they really need to happen now. For instance, you know, the freedom of choice to decide over women, you know, women to decide over their bodies, or women and people who can get pregnant. If they want to terminate that pregnancy, that should be a right for everyone everywhere, right? So that's one thing that is a very sort of, yes, nearby close goal that is very concrete, that isn't like, you know, permanent revolution over there. It's like, no, we need this to happen now in order for there to be a little more well-being, a little more freedom, a little more equality.
Exactly.
Right?
These are these
same with
on the way.
Exactly. Is that the end of our fight? Of course not. It is one sort of close by objective, and the horizon is still back here, right? Again, ending the fact that there are 10 women murdered every day. It's mind-blowing, it's mind-bending, it's inhuman, right? So how is this not something that we need to end right now? This needs to not happen anymore. This is something that needs to stop immediately, right? It's so complicated to get there. It's sort of like, okay, steps. It's actually gotten worse instead of better. Like, what is going on? Several things. Of course, there's like wars, weapons, militarization, so-called war on drugs, all kinds of things that are happening that contribute to that. So then it gets, again, you can't just isolate that one problem, be like, okay, so gender violence has to do with women and men or whatever. No, it has to do very complicated. So again, the horizon, right? It like pulls back, steps back, you know. So yes, there are certain things that are very concrete and within our reach. And then there are certain things that are very distant, but that we should always be striving for somehow, right? That we keep there sort of as beacons of, okay, that's where one day we will go there. And I also always keep in mind, there's a wonderful journalist and activist in Mexico who had to leave the country because of the work she did in terms of gender violence. She always says, you know, Lydia Becho is her name. She always says, you know, you can only do when things get so overwhelming, like, okay, how do we, find democracy, or how do we get, it's like, oh, it's paralyzing. And then you just kind of want to watch Netflix and sort of get under the covers and never come out, right? Um, so what she taught me was like, just do whatever these two hands can do.
Mm-hmm.
Don't try to, fix democracy, or, end, world hunger. That's not,
Contribute
that's,
your part
yeah,
somehow.
do your part and organize with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, like this idea of the individual's solution is what it's a trick of capitalism. Like, oh, okay, I'm not gonna use straws anymore. So I'm cool. I help the earth.
Mm-hmm.
That's obviously not a solution. But yes, whatever you can do, and then organize with others to sort of start opening
Mm-hmm.
these
Mm-hmm.
little cracks. And all of the examples in these texts are I think exactly of that, like small, tiny micro actions, but then linked to others that then have tiny, tiny ripple effects that maybe, you know, take us places.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was perhaps like a very beautiful end. I don't want to add anything because that would open something else. I think it was a good kind of end because it also, I think it kind of resonates with people listening and kind of like thinking about what they can do or what they can do with their hands. Let's see if there is like questions. No, I don't see any questions. Perhaps then I would like to give one image kind of as a also like to end and also like to share with you, Gabriela, that like Cinthia told me that like one of her references for her tools, like for the wrapping of the tools, is the work of a Brazilian artist, Bispo Rosario, who lived in a how do you say, like a psycho like in a clinic for mental ill people, so called, or kind of like 30 years. And what he did is like all his time being there, he used the uniforms of the people working there who kept him there and kind of deconstructed them, kind of pulled out the threads so that the whole structure and the shirt and the trousers and everything kind of fell apart. Kind of like the uniform of his kind of gatekeepers, or not gatekeepers, but like the prison guards, so to say.
Guards, yeah.
Guards kind of deconstructed them and used that thread on the one hand he wrapped also different objects from a mill to like a spoon to like very different objects, and he also wrapped them around. And it's kind of like, for me, it was always like a way of like taking care perhaps like of these objects. And then on the other hand, he also used these threads for stitching. Like he used like bed sheets and he was like stitching um like on these bed sheets. And on the one hand, there was also kind of like a very religious context, obviously, or like not obviously, but like in his case it was like a religious context, also thinking about the world, the afterworld, kind of like imagining the afterworld, like how is the afterworld looking like. And on the other hand, he also kind of made kind of like a encyclopedic depiction of the now, of this world, of the life he's living in. And then on the opposite, like the life, or kind of the how he imagines the afterlife. And I think that's kind of like perhaps like when we talk about spaces that anticipate like like a status or context or like a system that we live in. For me that was also like very beautiful, like in the way that he worked and kind of like how he imagined the world as he, like where he wants to go, where he kind of like looks forward to go.
Yeah, and also in so doing, he is leaving testimony, like material testimony
Mm-hmm.
of how his sort of his own like dignity in this world, and his sort of subversion of what we think of as crazy or insane,
exactly.
of someone who should be locked up or whatever. And he was like, well, just look at this, you know. Yeah, those objects are, by the way, or those pieces are absolutely stunning. They're in the catalog if people out there want to go get the catalog. They're very beautiful, but also you can Google and you can find a lot of those pieces. But yeah, I thank you for closing with those images.
Good, and thank you so much. I'm very happy that we could have this conversation with you in the context of the show, and that you were sharing like of your experience of writing, of working with all these authors from your book. And I hope, and I'm looking forward to make advertising for the English translation, and for the, I mean, it's a new book also because it's like a combination of the two tsunamis.
Yeah, it is a new thing, kind of, because the conversations that will happen will be different. Yeah. So I'm also very excited about that. But thank you, Anna. And thank you again for inviting me to think of this and to, think about what Cinthia does with collaboration and with transformation of the everyday into something poetic or something wondrous. So thank you again, and I hope that everyone enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully they'll get to see the show. I'm sad I'm not I'm not in Germany. I can't see the show, but
unfortunately, it
anyway,
already closes
at least
in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, people, go check it out.
Exactly. Good. Then I would close here, and I should say goodbye. And thank you also for everyone who stayed with us and listened. And see you next time. Bye.
Bye, Anna.
Bye, Gabriela.